tell a story that I hope you find fascinating. It's a story that's not been told before. Years ago, I became interested in exactly how George Washington got from Newport, where he had the army, up to Chadds Ford. And I'll bet you can pick up any history book on the subject and you cannot find a single line on that. All the historians start at the battle, but they don't tell us how Washington got there. Now, the British march is covered in enormous detail. British kept great records. And we know how the British got to Chadds Ford via Kennett Square and down Route 1, etc. But I challenge you to find anything written in a history book in any detail at all on how George Washington got there. So I spent the last 5 or 6 years trying to answer this question. How did Washington get the Continental Army to Chadds Ford? Am I doing this right? Okay, maybe that's going to be better. Okay. So what I'm going to present today is the results of my investigation and analysis. I don't have the complete answer. There are still things yet to be discovered, but I believe I've got about the 70% solution. I focused my analysis on the military imperatives of making this march. Where primary sources are not existent, I've bridged the gap with what I believe are reasonable and sound military assumptions. Where possible, I'm going to tell the story in the words of the participants themselves. I'm confident in my conclusions. Where there's uncertainty, I'll let you know. I'll tell you where I'm not certain. But I think I've got it pretty close. I want to say at the outset that I'm wide open to other ideas and opinions, and I welcome challenges to my assumptions and my conclusions. Please feel free to ask any question or ask for any clarification as we go through. There's a lot of technical data here, and I'm really concerned that I put anybody to sleep here, so I'm going to kind of move through the technical stuff very fast, but I'm here after the briefing if you want to come, and like march rates and past times and all this kind of thing. I don't think that's going to be of interest to most people. My aim is to give you a coherent and informative overview that's interesting and taps your curiosity to learn some more. I sincerely hope that you do learn something new and interesting today. So let's go back to 1777 and let's have some fun. Before we get started, I want to make a dedication. Judge John Niels was a historian, a patriot here in Delaware. He was also a judge. And in 1927, he gave the keynote speech at the new dedication at Couch's Bridge. He published a pamphlet, and in that pamphlet he had this little inscription. If you can't read it, I'll read it to you here. It says, this pamphlet is circulated in the hope that it may inspire some real student of history to write a fully documented story of Washington's army in Delaware in the summer of 1777. Well, I'm just taking a bite of that apple, but I just want to say, Judge Nels, this briefing is for you. We got this ball rolling, and hopefully I can do it some justice. So here's the purpose and the expected outcomes today. So what we want to leave here with is an idea of what the march echelons were, the order of march, the timeline, the specific routes, where they forded the Brandywine. And we also want to say where Washington himself crossed the Brandywine. How did he get up to Chadds Ford, he personally? I think I've got the answer to that. All of these folks, not just Washington, were here in Delaware. They were all part of the Continental Army in the fall of 1777. And that's quite a list of folks, and I didn't put them all on there. And if you look at the last two, one is going to be a future president, James Monroe. He's a lieutenant at the time. So is John Marshall, who would later become the Supreme Court Justice. They were all here in Delaware. And specifically, they were about 3,700 feet from where you're sitting right now.
Oh my.
They marched right down Center Road, right behind us here. And I'm going to show you these routes, but they were all part of that army. Lafayette was here too, and Lafayette and Washington were kind of joined at the hip at this part of their lives. He had just come to the United States, and he was sort of being mentored by Washington, and this was his first deployment, if you will, with the Continental Army. So he's brand new and he's here. in Delaware, and he's at Washington's side, and he's gonna stay at Washington's side through this whole campaign. Okay, here's the key questions that we're gonna address today. What routes did they use? How did Washington plan the march? Did he have a guide? Okay. And what about the Continental baggage, big baggage train, and the Continental artillery? How did that element get up to Chadds Ford, and what roads did he use? We're gonna cover all of that. Now, I put on here, on this map, something you might be familiar with, Buckley's Tavern. try to center this. How many people here are from northern Delaware or Chester County? Because this is right in your wheelhouse here. You're gonna recognize a lot of these places. And at the end of this briefing, I'm gonna show you a map so you can go out and find these today, because most of these sites exist today. Fortunately for us, this area has been pretty well preserved and you can find it today. All right, the agenda we're gonna follow very quickly. We're gonna go through the methodology that we used, a little bit of a strategic overview, facts, assumptions, etc., and we're gonna get right to it. This is the methodology I used. This is the sources, if you will. There are a lot of primary sources that you can find. The regimental orderly books. Washington kept great orders. His penmen, when they were here in Wilmington, wrote fantastic orders. There's a lot of detail in those orders. There are some maps that we can use, and one of them is Washington's map, and I'm going to show you that here later. I also did some personal reconnaissance, and I'd like to thank my wingman, Jim Hart, my buddy from high school here in Delaware. That's him right there in the boat, in the canoe. We had, the only way you can get to some of these fords is by canoe. So we canoed down the Brandywine a couple times to find these places. And it was a lot of fun, it was very interesting. And I'll also try to mention where these places are. I'll show you some photos of where they are. What's missing? There is no written order for this march. When Washington marched to Chadds Ford, it doesn't exist because he did it so quickly. He kept great orders when he was here in Delaware, but there's a big zero for the 9th of September. He didn't write an order because it was so hasty. They left at 2 a.m. and they had to move quickly to get up there. So everything was verbal. So that's missing. We don't have that. The other thing we don't have is a map that says this is how it got there. Now, there are two maps that exist that purport to show the route of the Army. One is the Price and Price map, and Kim, I know you're familiar with that map. But that map has some issues, and I'll go over that map here. I'll show you that map. There's another one that was made by Major John Andre of the British Army, and it just shows a general axis of advance, if you will, across the Brandywine, and it really isn't very conclusive. But those are the only two maps that I know of that even attempt to lay out how Washington got there. And as I said, both of them have some issues. All right, the operational overview, very quickly. The British land at the head of Elk with a massive army, General Howe. And General Howe's intent is to quickly end this war, this Revolutionary War, by taking Philadelphia. Washington brings the entire Continental Army to Wilmington, where he thinks he's going to block General Howe. And he assumes that General Howe is going to take the King's Highway, which generally, if you go to Wilmington today, is Maryland Avenue coming into Wilmington, and then becomes, on the other side of Wilmington, becomes the Philadelphia Pike. That's the King's Highway. And that's the way that Washington thinks Howe is going to take Philadelphia. So that's the reason for the army coming here. So he puts the army originally in Wilmington, and that's not such a great place to defend, because what's the problem? There's a river at your back, and you never want to defend with a river at your back. It's going to clog you right up. You're not going to get out of there. So his generals convince him to move down to Red Clay Creek, and that's where the march commences eventually to go up to Chadds Ford. So they occupy two different positions. The area that we're going to focus on today is this area of northern Delaware and southern Pennsylvania, because this is where all the action takes place for Washington to get up to Chadds Ford. And I think you're going to find a lot of this area very familiar if you're from this region. All right, Washington comes to Delaware, comes to Wilmington, and he immediately sets out to do reconnaissance. And these are actual lifts from the orders or from diaries or records about Washington's reconnaissance. And as you can see, he's out looking for things. Now, you all probably know that he did a very famous reconnaissance down to Iron Hill, where he watched the British as they assembled after they got off the ships at Head of Elk. He rides all the way down to Elk, and he's got Lafayette with him, he's got General Greene with him. But he did another reconnaissance. He actually rode all the way up the Brandywine on the east side from Wilmington to Chadds Ford. And he stayed at Chadds Ford for dinner that night in the Ring House, and then he returned to Wilmington. Seems like a long way, but for those folks on horseback then, it wasn't really that bad. And the trails along the east side of the Brandywine, and some of them are parks today, that's the same trail that he rode on, okay? So he was out doing his business and doing it pretty well. Now, you see this last quote here. That author's actually wrong. Washington didn't station troops at Piles Ford after this reconnaissance. He stationed them 2 other fords, and I'm going to show you because I got his order. Now, you can't read that, but I'm going to read it to you here. When he finished that reconnaissance, he came back and he said this is a quote: General Potter will order 2 battalions of militia each, to be 250, rather more than fewer, to march one to Richling's Ford, that's Rockland, Delaware, and the other to Gibson's Ford, which is today Smith's Bridge, and take post on the east side of the Brandywine and fix upon the best ground for defending these passes, unquote. So what Washington is doing as a result of his reconnaissance, remember, he thinks he's going to fight the British in Wilmington, so he wants to cover his northern flank. He doesn't want them sneaking around. And in those days, you had to use the fords because the Brandywine was much deeper because we had mills and we had more dams along the river. So you can't ford it in places like you can today. Everybody looks at the Brandywine, looks pretty shallow today. But in those days it wasn't. These fords were absolutely critical. So if you're familiar with that little town, Rockland, Delaware, and I think most people are familiar with the old covered bridge up at Smith's Bridge, there were fords then, and the Continental Army was stationed at both of those places, 250 troops each. And we probably drive by there in our lifetimes all the time, taken for granted, but it was pretty bustling back in 1777. So that was a result of this reconnaissance. Now, Washington comes to Delaware, but he needs a map. He's not familiar. He's been through here on the King's Highway, but only into the city of Wilmington. So Jacob Broome, many of you know Broome Street of Wilmington, who is a surveyor, makes a map for him. And this is the map that he makes. Now, I put 2 stars on this map. This is Jansen's Market, and that's Buckley's again, just to orient you, okay? So this upper blue line here, that's the Kennebec, all right? And this road here is the Concord Road, you'll see here, that's Concord Pike. So this map is the map that Jacob Broome made for George Washington, and I was telling the governor who's here, and thank you, Governor, for being here, really appreciate it. I found this map almost by accident at Hagley. I knew it existed, but I didn't have a copy. And the reason it's so important, it's a Rosetta Stone. It tells us what Newcastle County looked like in 1777. We know what roads that existed. And you see the little scribbles here. This is George Washington's handwriting on the map. Okay? He did that reconnaissance up the Brandywine, and he made some notes on the ford. And very interesting, this word, you can't make it out, but it says places unfordable. So between Wilmington and Smith's Bridge, the river was too deep to ford. Now today you can probably find places where you could wade across, but back then you couldn't. So these fords were absolutely critical for the Army. Now remember, in Washington's mind, he is going to fight the decisive battle of the Revolution in Wilmington, Delaware. So he's got to guard up to his northern flank, because he thinks the British are going to march right up through Wilmington and take Philadelphia. That's what he does. Now, he makes a note here on Corner Ford. Now, you can't get to Corner Ford today unless you have a canoe. It's just north of Smith's Bridge. It's up there about a half mile north of Smith's Bridge. I think the DuPonts own that land up at Smith's Bridge. But the road network is there, and when you go in on a canoe and you look at that ford, it is exactly today as he described it in 1777. Very good, but broken ground and narrow defiles on the east side. Okay, and it's incredible how well preserved that area is. But you get out and you see that ford, and you can just feel the Continental troops coming across that ford. So this map turns out to be absolutely critical to Washington to understand the terrain. Now, there's a little town that you may be familiar with that's just north of Centerville called Fairview. I think there's like a bed and breakfast up there, the Fairview Inn, but there's a cluster of colonial buildings up there too. And it's very, very important to what we're going to talk about today. There's a road called Stockford Road. Just the name ought to tell you something. It has the word Ford in it. That road leads to Chadds Ford, okay? There's a road called Cosart Road, which some of you may have been on. If you go up Route 100, Montchanan Road, there's an old, there's a fruit market there along the river. I think it's across from the Harry Haskell farm. Yeah. Cosart Road runs down right to that. Now, these roads are important for a number of reasons, and I'm going to point one other one out. Piles Ford Road. It wasn't called Piles Ford Road back then because Piles Ford wasn't called Piles Ford back then. I think it was called Gibson's Ford, which was going to confuse it because there were two Fords called Gibson's Ford. Piles was one of them, and Smith's Bridge. And boy, you talk about confusion. You can get it. I'm going to try to refer to these Fords in their current form today so I don't confuse too many people. But here's the most important thing. Piles Ford Road did not lead to Piles Ford in 1777. It led to Smith's Bridge. Okay? The way you got to Piles Ford in those days was Cosart Road. Led right down to it. Okay? So Piles Ford and Piles Ford Road is a modern convention of the 19th century. It didn't come into existence, and if you look at the map here, it doesn't show any way to get up there on this side of the river, okay, on the west side of the river. So the way you got to this ford was this way, and you got to Chadds Ford by going down Stockford Road, and this will become very important as we discuss this march. Okay? And this map, I just can't emphasize how important it is. But keep in mind these fords. I'll build this just a little more if you can't quite see them. There's Chadds, Piles, Corner, and Smith's. Now there are two other fords below that. There's one where Thompson's Bridge is today. That was called Hollingsworth Ford, and then there's of course Rockland, Delaware, what they call Richland's Ford back in the day. I don't think Hollingsworth Ford was a player because I think the river was too deep there, and that's a modern. You know, maybe when I say modern, maybe in the 1850s, 1860s it became a Ford, but it certainly didn't seem like it was very good back in the day. So these are the four Fords we're gonna concentrate on. If you're Washington and you're trying to outmarch the British to Chadds Ford, you want to get the Brandywine between you and the British as fast as you can. Okay, you don't want that river on your flank or in your back. You want it between you and the enemy. So keep that in mind as we consider how this is going to play out. Okay. What are the key facts? These are not in dispute. These we know. These are going to be different than the assumptions I'm going to make here in a second. Well, we know the Continental Army was about 14,000 plus, and you can get gray hairs trying to figure out exactly how big the Army was, but we're just going to say 14,000 plus here. There was a baggage train of 250 plus wagons. And we know they were in Wilmington, and Washington said put them on the east side of the Brandywine to protect them. So they were all clustered at Wilmington on the east side of the Brandywine. We already talked about no written order. Now, the park of artillery was about 42 guns. There was a total of 51. And when I say a total, this is an assumption. This is the only thing in here that's not a fact, because I cannot figure out for the life of me after 6 years, I can't figure out how many cannon he had. And I've called a number of historians, including Michael Harris, who wrote the brilliant book on the Brandywine, and he said he got a lot of gray hairs trying to figure this one out too. But I think I'm pretty close. The British seem to think that it was around this number, but we're going to deal for our purposes here with 42 guns. That's what he took to Chadds Ford. He left 9 guns in Wilmington. And if we have time at the end, we can talk about why he did that, but he left 9 guns. What I believe, and I can't prove this, I think he had more cannon than he had crews that could man them. Cannons weren't short, but trained artillery crews were. And I think he didn't quite have enough, and I'll get into this a little bit later. All right, the day that he makes the march up to Chadds Ford, it's the 9th and 10th of September, it starts on the 9th. We can place Washington at two specific places. We can place him right up the street here at the Crooked Billet Tavern, which is at the corner of Kennett Pike and Center Road. We know he was there. We have two primary sources that can place him there. And we know he was someplace 8 miles from Wilmington, because that's what's on the message that he sent to the Continental Congress. When he got underway and was moving the army up to Chadds Ford, he stopped and wrote the Continental Congress a message. And he said, I'm moving the army. Well, where was he? I'm going to show you where I think he was. I think there's only one place he could have been, and I'll give you my reasoning for that. But we know, those are 2 points where we know during the day where he was. And this is going to help us figure out some things later as we break the code here. I've talked about a lot of these things. Just want to mention another fact. When we talk about Chadds Ford, it's really 2 places. It's 2 locations. It's a ford, and there was a ferry about 450 meters down, okay, 450 yards, I guess. And that ferry is going to be critical when we talk about moving the army. Okay. Now, if you go down to Newport and Red Clay Creek, I know this is a little busy slide here, but this is how the Army was arrayed. Remember, I said he brought the Army originally to Wilmington, but his commanders talked him into moving further forward to get down forward in better defensive positions. And I'm going to read you something here, a quote. This is from Alexander Hamilton, who was his adjutant, one of his adjutants, in this endeavor. And Hamilton writes from Wilmington about the defensive situation in Wilmington. Here it is, quote, "This country does not abound in good posts, and is so little mountainous that it is impossible to find a spot not liable to capital defects. The one we have is, all things considered, the best we could find, but there is no great dependence to be placed upon it." Alexander Hamilton, 1 September 1777 in Wilmington, Delaware. So what he's saying is that this position we have in Wilmington isn't the best. And where they were in Wilmington, they were occupying Quaker Hill. They had an artillery battery up where St. Elizabeth's Church is on the high ground. They were covering the approaches to Wilmington on the King's Highway, which is today Maryland Avenue. So his generals, and I think his generals really didn't like having the river right at their back. That is not a good position to be in. It gets squeezed like that. So they moved out to better defensive ground in the Red Clay Creek area. And he put his headquarters in Newport, you know, between Stanton and Marshallton, where the Army was. And that's how you see him arrayed here. He put him in 3 lines, and he put the artillery, the park of artillery, at Price's Corner, okay? So where the Sears was at Price's Corner, that was where the 42 guns were. Now, what the Army would typically do when they got in defensive positions, some guns would be assigned to the brigades. You normally would put 2 cannons with each brigade, but then when they moved, they'd bring the artillery back together and they'd move as a unit. So this is how he's arrayed right before he moves up to Chadds Ford. And as you all know, the British start flanking up towards Kennett Square, and one of the problems with this campaign is that Washington never knows for sure at any time during this campaign where the British are. He thinks he knows where they are. He thinks he has a feel, but you know how communications were in those days. You know, you're depending on the last rider to come in, and you don't know if what he's telling you is up to date or the guy before was up to date. So it was tough. It was tough to really know with any accuracy where the British were, but he did finally figure out they were moving in the wee hours of the 8th of September, and they had an early morning meeting to get the Army out. And this is the way they were arrayed before they left. Okay, the order of battle, I'm not going to spend too much time. This is the best estimate I could make on each of these divisions, how big they were. And by today's standards, we would call them brigades. They really weren't that big. The biggest formation was the militia. There were 2 brigades under Armstrong, Potter and Irving. And I'm going to refer to those militia by Potter and Irving from now on and not Armstrong, because they were independently employed. If I back up, you can see the militia here under Potter and this one. Now, these were the guys that were guarding the 2 fords I talked about, but he eventually called them off the fords and called them forward. Irving, he had left back in Wilmington to build a second bridge across the Brandywine, because there was one bridge across the Brandywine. It's the only one that existed in 1777 between Wilmington and Chadds Ford. And that's the Market Street Bridge we all know today. But Washington didn't want to get stuck up against the river, so he had a second bridge being made, and there was another ford. There was a ford there at the base of Adams Street, right where the zoo is today. So he had 3 ways to get across the river, but it still wasn't enough, and they moved forward. Okay, these are assumptions. Now, these are my assumptions, and this you don't have to agree with these, but I think these are reasonably assumptions. I'm going to demonstrate why I think these are good assumptions. I believe that when the Army eventually moves to Chadds Ford, they move in 3 echelons. The first echelon is what we call Sullivan's Command. He had 3 divisions. The second echelon is the main body, and the third echelon is the rear guard that was left in Stanton. And that's really not an assumption. We know he left Potter and Irving in contact with what he thought was the British while he moved the Army up. He eventually moves them later, but they stay behind as the rear guard. Knox moved the artillery together up Kennet Pike as a group. And that's an assumption, but I think it's a good one. I think Washington trusted Knox implicitly. As you all know, Knox got the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston. Probably one of his most trusted subordinates. And you wanted to have those cannon, you didn't want to take any chances. You needed them all to get up to Chadds Ford, and you needed to have a route that could support the cannon. And I'm going to show you where I think that route was. But I think they moved together. He did not keep the cannon out with the brigades. The brigades just moved on foot to get up there. I think that they executed a near simultaneous movement, and they used 4 of the 6 fords to get up there. The first echelon is these 3 divisions, and they're going to end up at the northern part of Chadds Ford. They're going to be north of Chadds Ford when they get up there. The second one is Greene, Wayne, and Nash. They're going to be on the ford or just south of it. And then Potter and Irving are going to be in the south. They're going to cover these fords in the south. Okay? So it makes sense they would have moved like this. You want to get these guys up and out of the way, and then these guys, and then these guys. The baggage train, which is on the east side of the Brandywine at Wilmington, goes up the Concord Pike to Dilworth Town. And that's where they put the baggage. Washington was very, very concerned about the baggage, and you read in his orders, get everything on the east side of the Brandywine. You don't want to risk losing our baggage. Okay, I have a quote. Even the Romans knew that when you move an army, it's one of the most dangerous times for the army. And I'll let you read that. Think about Washington. He's got pretty much an amateur army at this time. Many of the regiments don't even have bayonets. Okay, the British have bayonets and they know how to use them. All right, we haven't had von Steuben come on the scene yet. That doesn't happen until the following winter in Valley Forge. So this is still pretty much an amateur force. It's the best he has, but he doesn't want to meet the British unless it's under favorable conditions. The last thing he can afford is to march that army up to Chadds Ford and go bump in the night with the British. He would lose, for sure. It would be a rout. He wants to avoid that, okay? Now this particular image here, I call this presentation the Invisible March, and the reason I call it invisible for 2 reasons. One, we don't know anything about it because the historians don't write about it. And 2, most of this march took place at night. So many of the people that lived in the area wouldn't have seen them, okay? They would have seen the ones that marched the next day, but not these original early marching echelons. Now, this particular picture, I had an artist do this. This is Center Road, and then this is the Kennet Pike. And that's the key turn at the Crooked Billet Tavern. The Crooked Billet Tavern is still there today. You can see it. I think there's an over 55 community being put in, and they're calling it the Crooked Billet right around. But I took this picture. Don Kirtley, who's here, took me in with John Riley, and we went in and got a good look at it. But it's still there. The original part that Washington was in, where he had his breakfast there that morning, it's still standing, but they've added on to it. But the Crooked Billet's still there, and it becomes an important landmark because the soldiers of the time didn't know where they were most of the time. But they had to rely on landmarks, and you'll see in some of the diaries, and I'm going to quote here, they knew where the Crooked Billet was, and they would say, oh, we walked by the Crooked Billet. That's how they knew where they were. You know, if they walked by a tavern or an intersection, it was marked. Okay. Everything that I'm going to propose this afternoon is based on these military imperatives, and everything I want to tell you, if you don't sign up to this, is a house of cards. Everything I've done to look at this march, I measured against these three military imperatives. It had to meet these, and if it didn't, it wouldn't make sense. Remember, Washington was a smart guy. He was a really smart guy, and he'd been burned many times by the British, especially in Long Island when he gets flanked. He's got some scar tissue on him, okay? So he's going to use these military imperatives to move the army. The first one is speed. He's got to get up to Chad's Ford before the British. He's got to go fast. So speed is essential. So any route we look at has to provide speed to get there. The second one is security. He cannot afford to run into the British, what the military calls a meeting engagement. And a meeting engagement's another word for a goat rope. You know, either side, you just go bump in the night, you meet each other, and that would have been a disaster. So he had to have a route that was very, very secure. And the third thing, he had to make it simple. The troops didn't know the region, okay? There were some that knew it, but not a lot. So he had to have a simple route, had to provide speed, and had to provide security. So everything you do when you look at this, if it doesn't meet these criteria, it's probably not the right answer, okay? This is one of the maps that exists. This is the famous Price and Price map, and it is in the 1927 pamphlet that Judge Nelds had. And it's got some problems. There's a lot of good things about this map because it is very accurate as far as the geography, and it really provides some wonderful information. But it's the only map I know of. It says here the route of Washington's army, and it shows the route. I'm going to talk about this. I think it's correct. Here you see the army arrayed down at Price's Corner at Stanton, Newport, and then they come up Center Road here to the Crooked Billet. You see the Crooked Billet there. And then they turn left, go by Jansen's Market, all the way up. And you see where it says Brick Church here? That's the lower Brandywine Presbyterian Church. But of course, in the Revolution, it wasn't brick, it was wooden, and it didn't become brick until 1859. So that's the earliest this map can be, okay? This is where things get a little crazy, because this route didn't exist in 1777. This is a modern convention. When the road did go there, this is Piles Ford Road, and it shows going over Piles Ford, the bridge at Piles Ford. Well, first of all, Piles Ford wasn't located there in 1777, and this road didn't exist in 1777. So somebody is putting legacy data on this map because this is what they thought. This is the way they thought the army went. Now, I do think some troops went this way, okay? But they didn't go to Piles Ford. They actually went across at Smith's Bridge, where this would have led to. Okay, so it's a slightly off. The map is perfectly fine with everything else, but there's little hints on here that it can't be a colonial map. You know, it refers to Lancaster Pike. Well, of course, it wasn't a turnpike until 1811. So you know that there's some issues here. It's really hard to find the original source for this map. I've looked. Price and Price were engineering and surveying company, but it's really difficult to find the exact origins of this map. But you'll see this a lot. But just keep in mind there's some issues with this one. Now, what did the roads look like in 1777? Well, we don't know for sure. Okay, I think that the Kennet Pike might have looked something like this. Okay, remember the Kennet Pike we know today wasn't necessarily the Kennet Pike of 1777. When you got to that brick church, the lower Brandywine Presbyterian, it went left and it went to Kennet Square. That's why it was called the Kennet Pike. And what went up north was probably not as good a road. Okay. This particular road, I took this picture when I got off the canoe at Corner Ford, and that's one of the original colonial roads on DuPont property that probably hasn't changed in 200 some years. It looks pretty much the same, so I think that whenever you see these banks on either side, you know you're looking at an old road. And I think, and this road was in fact used by the Continental Army. Some of the divisions did use this road. The only way you get to it today is to sneak in there. I snuck in a couple of 100 meters when I got out of the canoe and took the picture, but it's private property. But that pretty much gives you an idea what the roads might have looked like back then. Today, the roads look like this. And I would say Cosart Road, Stockford Road are absolutely wonderful places. If you have some time, go drive down there. And I guarantee you, you'll go back in time when you drive down those roads. You feel like you're back in 1777 on those roads. And they are very, very significant because I believe the majority of the Army moved down this road, Stockford Road. And see this old colonial building, I think it dates to like 1750. They would have seen this. You're looking at what they saw when they went down this road. And it leads right to the ford. It leads right to the Chad's Ford. Okay, so once again, the fords, I think these are out of play. I may be wrong about that. There may be some militia that use those. It's certainly possible, but I think I can make a good case that they used all 4 of these upper fords. So, what do they say about it? This is General Howe's testimony that he gave before the House of Parliament in 1779, and he clearly says that the Army crossed the Brandywine at Chad's Ford, and that's true. He doesn't say by what route they got there, but he says they crossed the Chad's Ford. This does comport with all the other sources. A good part of the Army did cross the Chad's Ford. Here's Colonel Pickering. Now, Washington had a staff. Pickering was the chief of staff, and it moved separately to Washington. He called this his family, his headquarters group. He called them his family. But Washington would generally go with the Army. Take some aide to camps, probably Lafayette. He'd be with the Army. Pickering would take the headquarters up. So Pickering probably moved with the first echelon, and he says very clearly, we marched to Chad's Ford and we crossed it, no doubt about it. The Delaware Regiment Orderly Book, one of the few that actually gives some good information, same thing, marched 10 miles to Chad's Ford and forded over. So we know, and they were in the first echelon. They were in Sullivan's northern wing. We have a couple of diaries. Here you see the reference to the Crooked Billet, so we know the Army went right by. We marched up into Chester County. This one from the 3rd Virginia poses some problems. It solves some problems, but it poses others. It kind of verifies the march distance, which I calculated independently of this, and I came up with 14 miles. And when you add this up, he comes up with 14 miles. And that was about the length it took to get up to Chad's Ford. But as I said, a lot of times they didn't know where they were, they'd make mistakes, and if you follow this word for word, he would have ended up in the British positions because he makes a 180-degree error. He says they marched due west, and he must have meant due east. Everything else lines up perfectly if you just change that one word. But this is kind of the frustration you have sometimes with these old manuscripts, you know, that the guys just make mistakes and they don't know it. I'm sure he meant to write east instead of west, because had he done this, he'd have marched right into the British position. Now the fords today are still there. You can still see them. This particular one. The Chad's Ford is where the bridge is up there on Route 1, but just south of it is where the ferry was, and this is it today. Piles Ford is not where the bridge is today. It's further south, and I have a better picture of Piles Ford I'll show you later. There's Corner Ford. And like I say, I pulled the canoe up over here, and this is the one that Washington described. And when you go there today, it's exactly as he described it. The only way you can get there is on canoe. And of course, you're all familiar with Gibson's or Smith's Bridge. Of course, we have a bridge there now, but there was no bridge in 1777. The original Piles Ford is right across from where the Harry Haskell farm is and where that fruit market is on Route 100. It's right here. And you can see the rut marks on the original trail that led down to the ford. And that's the ford, that's the other side of the ford looking from this side, from the west side over to the east. And today, you can just tell that was a ford. It's no doubt when you see it that it was used as a ford. And if you look overhead, this is part of that fruit market I was talking about. There's Creek Road and Route 100. The Cosart Road comes in over here, and it would have been the access road to get to the ford. And overhead usually never lies. You can see the rut marks down to the original ford there. And this is key because I'm going to propose later that I believe this is where Washington crossed. He actually took this ford. And I'm going to present the evidence for that here a little bit later. There's Corner Ford once again, as I described, just absolutely as Washington described it. And of course Gibson Ford. Now this is very strategic because Smith's Bridge Road that leads up to the Concord Pike was back in those days called the Road to Chester. And you certainly wanted to protect that road. You didn't want the British getting on there. And the historians have this just a little bit wrong. most history books say the furthest south that the Continental troops were deployed in the Battle of Brandywine was Pilesport, but that is not correct. The troops were actually deployed to Smith's Bridge during the Battle of Brandywine to protect the road to Chester, and I'll show you some maps later that verify that. Okay, what's the operational situation right before the march? Washington, as you see by this first quote, doesn't know where the British are. He's not clear what they're gonna do on the 8th. And the next quote just tells you that Howe confirms what we've all assumed, is that Washington didn't want a confrontation with the British unless he was in the absolute best position, prepared defensive positions. It's the only way he could meet the British and have any chance of success. And Howe says, I've got to do something to smoke him out. I got to start moving to get him moving, so we can have a battle. And then this is what Lafayette says. You know, of course, there was a meeting, and Kim, I think that was at the Hale Burns house where they had this meeting, where you live, and Lafayette refers to it here. And this is where they hastily got together and made the plans to do the march. Now, did he get up there alone, or did he have help? Washington had a guide. And as I said, he did a recon up the east side of the Brandywine, but he wasn't familiar with the other side. And when he tried to find locals to help him, the locals down in the Newport area only knew the local roads right around them. They didn't know the road network up around northern Newcastle County, Chester County. But there was a colonel on the staff from the Delaware militia, Colonel Duff, who said, I know a guy that can get us there. I know a guy who knows this region. And it's this fellow right here. And it's Reverend Reed, and he was the pastor of a church down in Middletown. Now, I'm not sure exactly where he lived. The primary sources say that Colonel Duff rode 5 miles to get him. So he must have lived within 5 miles of Newport. But he comes back to Washington's headquarters, and he helps Washington map out the routes for the Army to take in the early morning hours of 9 September. So this is pretty key. And he did great service. Now, I have read anecdotally through a Hessian source that at some point they captured this fellow, the British captured him, and that's how they knew Washington was crossing at Chadds Ford. Okay, so now the Army has to depart, and this is what the primary sources have to say. Now, I want to point out the second one. John McKinley, who was the first governor of Delaware, they called him the president back then. He was in the militia at this point. He wasn't yet the first governor. He was there where the Army was, and he says that they're moving to Chadds Ford to outmarch the British. Now, I'm not saying this was a desperate march, but let's just say they were moving with haste. They were moving quickly to get up there, which is why there's no written order. And McKinley confirms that. He was right there. And he later says that they left behind the 2 brigades to guard their rear, the 2 rear guard brigades. Now, I'm going to quickly skip over this, but these are some of the march parameters I use, and I think that would just put everybody to sleep. We can come back later. Okay, let's talk about the artillery. I think that there were 42 guns out of 51 that moved. 9 were left. You can see this quote. In fact, Kim, this comes out of one of your works. And this perfectly describes the park of artillery at Price's Corner. Okay? When you have guns for a half a mile, that's an artillery park. Right? Now, once they got up to Chadds Ford, once the artillery got up there, they dispersed the guns back to the brigades. And the way this is just me calculating this, but I figured they had 27 out to the brigades. And the main battery, Proctor's battery that sits over the Chad house there on the big hill at Chadds Ford, was 4 guns. And I always wondered why it was only 4 guns. And they have 11 guns in the reserve behind them. And my only assumption that I can make is they just didn't have enough crews to man all these guns. Right? Because it doesn't seem like they put a lot of guns in the main effort there. And they left the 9 guns in Wilmington. So they move out. Now, I put 550. That would, that may be an overestimate, but most of the historians seem to think it was about that much. But the main thing to take away is once they get on the road, because each gun has a couple of wagons to support it with shot and with powder, it's about 1.1 mile long column. And I've been very, very conservative in these calculations. It could have been much longer. And the only point I want to make to you is once this animal gets on the road, nobody else is coming behind because they're taking up all the oxygen, all right? They're taking the whole road up and you're not coming behind them. So that part of the march had to be planned very, very specifically. And I'll talk about how I think that occurred. The baggage train I've already discussed. There are some primary sources here. This comes from the first Continental Light Dragoons, Baylor Hill. He was one of the escorts the baggage. They just moved right up the Concord Pike, no doubt about it. They don't have to ford anything. It's a good road, leads right to where they want to go, very secure. I bet a month's pay on this, no doubt about it. This is how they got there. Now, if Washington came back in 1918, that's the Concord Pike in 1918, still not paved. I think you might have recognized it. And this is looking down. This is Blue Ball, I believe, on the right. So this is going into Wilmington. If you've ever taken that, everybody's driven down that way. You might recall that it was a toll road for 100 years. I think it stopped being a toll road in 1911. So imagine you had to pay for the privilege to travel on that. You know, it still wasn't paved here in 1918. So I think he would have definitely recognized the route of the baggage train. Just about a week later, the British come down the Concord Pike and occupy Wilmington with 3 regiments. Took the same route. Okay, I'm a little hesitant on these slides because they're a little busy. So you know, if anybody falls out of their chair from boredom, I apologize. But I just wanted to array this in some logical order. This shows the 3 wings: Sullivan's wing in the north, the main body, and then the rear guard. The routes they took, and then what fords they took. Okay. And I've got it a little more detail on the next slide because I've taken the different orderly books that I could find that listed what time they left. And some of the orderly books are good. They tell you exactly what time they left, and I can take a regiment because I know what division it was in, and I can figure out when the divisions then left. You know, it looks to me like Sullivan and Stevens both leave at the same time because there are regiments in each one of the divisions that say they left at 2. So they're marching parallel, 2 by 2, next to each other, up Kennett Pike, okay? So this command goes first. They're the ones that leave first. And there's one division that goes out at 4 ahead from the main body. So all these guys go up the Kennett Pike and get cleared, and then Knox comes up with the artillery at 5 a.m. And I'm putting 5 a.m. because I believe they waited till first light to move the artillery, to give them every chance of success. You can have a huge goat rope with all those horses and wagons in the dark, and I believe that they gave Knox every possible benefit and let him move during the daylight. So Knox is moving up Kennett Pike, and he's going to head to both the ford and the ferry. He needs both of those for the artillery. But once he gets on the road to Chad's Ford, there is nobody that's going to be able to follow him. So the follow-on units are going to have to take a different route, and I'm going to show you that here. Okay, the other point to make is that this is when the sun comes up, 0645, okay? So the lead units, these divisions, are all moving in darkness, okay? And as you can see, the first 3 are almost halfway there when the sun comes up. That's why it's an invisible march to most people, because they're moving at night, okay? And then you see the other people as they head off in the daylight. And of course, they have to move a little slower at night, and they can make a little bit better time. 14 miles is not that bad of a march. Easy for all of us to say, because we're not carrying all the equipment, but you know, for the Army of the time, it wasn't all that bad, except that it had to be done in darkness, and that presents some challenges. Once again, once the artillery gets on the road, it's going to clog it up, and nothing's moving past the artillery, because that's going to take time. The rear guard. And here's the words of the people that were there. McKinley talks about the 2 brigades being left behind. A very interesting quote here from a militiaman. He says he marched up the Brandywine to Smith's Ford. But the key thing is here, he says that regiment was stationed there during the battle. This is where I think historians have it wrong. They think everybody, the furthest south they were was Piles Ford. Piles Ford was really a Ford to nowhere when you compare it to Smith's Ford or Gibson Ford. That was a Ford that was strategic. It led to Chester. So this makes perfect sense. And there's some other primary source information that leads us to believe that. I double checked this with Michael Harris, and he agrees with this. And I think he actually said he might even change the next edition of his history book to reflect it, that Delaware was actually part of the Battle of Brandywine. This is an absolutely important footnote quote from a great historian, the guy that put all of Cecil Rodney's, Dr. Ryden. And it's a footnote, and you'd miss it unless you read this book real close, but he says something very, very profound here. He says that they moved in the early morning hours of the 9th in the direction of the Brandywine River, crossing at Chad's Ford and at fords below on the 10th. So the follow-on forces that are coming are using the other ones, which makes perfect sense. Okay, now I'm going to lay all this out on a map, so it's hopefully not too confusing. I'm going to use Washington's map to paint this picture. This is the route of the first echelon. All of these people that you see here moved up. There's the Crooked Billet, Buckley's would be about here, and then they moved up to that intersection in Fairview, and they took the Fairview Stockford Road. Sullivan, when he gets there, he goes down this way. Moving with him is Stephen. Stephen goes down Cosart, so they can both quickly, sorry about that, both quickly get across the Brandywine. So they're almost moving in parallel. And then Sterling comes behind them, and then Knox. And then what happens is once you get Knox on the road, he's the 300-pound gorilla. Then Green, Wayne, and Nash have to come up these other routes. So you see Green going down what we call today Piles Ford Road, and then you see Wayne and Nash going up Monchannon Road to Smith's and crossing there. Now, I told you if I was uncertain about something, I'd tell you. I'm not certain of the routes of this division and these two divisions. I'm pretty certain of the crossing points, but these make the most sense to me because you could put everybody out almost simultaneously and they wouldn't be bumping into each other. This makes sense to me that this is probably how they got there, and they make use of all the routes, of all the fords, and they're rapidly getting that river between them and the British. Now, somebody asked me once, why didn't they just, if you want to be simple, why didn't they just walk all the way up Kennet Pike to Route 1, turn right across Chad's Ford? Well, that's military malpractice. If you move up this road, you can see, this is the map Washington had now. It bears off to the north and to the west. And you're going right into the teeth of these guys, and you're not sure where they are. Now, he had Maxwell out there trying to scout, but as I said, Washington was never, ever sure in this whole campaign where the British were. And of course, that's why we lost the Battle of Brandywine, because he didn't know where they were. But to take them up this way would expose the flank of the army to a possible British attack and disaster. And it's longer. It doesn't meet the imperative of speed. It doesn't meet the imperative of security. And I don't think it meets the imperative of simplicity. So I have to put that out. That one is a no-go. He did not go that way. I cannot see a guy of Washington's stature even considering taking the army that way. He has faster routes, more secure routes this way. Okay, so that's if you have one slide you wanted to walk away with, this is the way Washington got to Chad's Ford. And today we don't think of any other road leading to Chad's Ford because that is such an obscure road, but it's a beautiful, beautiful road even today. And I urge you all to take a nice drive up there someday on a Sunday and look at it. You turn right at Fairview Road and it turns into Stockford Road. This is the intersection, okay? And you'll see these colonial buildings right there at the intersection. I believe they could have been there in Washington's time. This is where I think 8 miles from Wilmington is. I measured it. And from the intersection of Adams and Market Street, or Adams and Delaware Avenue to this intersection is actually 8.4 miles. And for somebody to write 8 miles from Wilmington on a message, they had to know it was 8 miles, which means they're on a road with milestones, which is the Kennet Road.
okay? And if you measure from different spots in Wilmington, you don't know where they measured it from, it'll almost come out to exactly 8 miles. And I've looked at every other possibility where 8 miles can be, and nothing else makes sense. This makes sense, and there's buildings there. Washington's penman could have gone in and written a message, and Washington would have wanted to be at this location, because this is where the Army was gonna make the critical turn to go down to Chad's Ford, and a good general's gonna be there. He's gonna be at the decisive point where his army is. And it just makes perfect sense that that's where he was, 8 miles from Wilmington, when he wrote that message. Okay, the rear guard comes up the next day on the 10th, and they take the routes. They just took the routes back to the bridges, to the fords they were guarding originally. Remember, they were guarding those fords when they were in Wilmington, and they were called up, so they just marched up to Kennett Pike, down Piles Ford Road, and then crossed over Smith's Bridge and Corner Ford. In 1825, Lafayette visited the United States, and he stayed with the DuPonts here in Wilmington. And the DuPonts took him up to the battlefield, and they had him in a carriage. And I've got some primary source documentation of this visit. And his secretary, Lafayette's secretary, writes that when they got here, that the militia was there in their old positions, which tells us again that the militia was as far south as Smith's Bridge, because the DuPonts took him to Smith's Bridge on the way up to Chad's Ford. Now I'm going to cover this here. Okay, I want to show you this picture. It's kind of interesting, and this is a perspective that we don't normally have. When you read these first person accounts and these primary sources, they always talk about what they can see. And they can see the movement, they can see Washington's movement, they can see the British doing this and this. I'm thinking, how can they see? I can't see anything. Because there were no trees back then. Everything was clear cut. Now this is in 1897. That's where Proctor's artillery was. This is the Chad House. This is looking at Wayne's position. This is what the British would have seen at the Battle of Brandywine. Chad's Ford's like right over here. Everything was clear cut. Everything. And this is the way it was. And I've got other photographs in this era, and we have more trees today than they had back then. I know it seems counterintuitive, but they really clear cut a lot back then. And they had greater sight lines than we have today. So when you read these descriptions, they're so detailed, and they're observing the movements of different units. Just remember, the terrain didn't look as it does today. It looks a lot different. Okay, how about Washington himself? How did he get across? How did he get up there? Where did he cross? Okay, you have to go with me now. I'm taking you on a trip, but you have to stay with me, because there's a number of assumptions we have to make. And the number one assumption is that Washington and Lafayette were together. Okay, and I believe that is a solid assumption. Everything I've read, every primary source, that he was stuck to him like glue, especially during this part of the campaign. And Lafayette himself says it. This is actually, he always refers to himself in the third person. He says, Marquis Lafayette is a volunteer that always accompanied the general. And there's other sources that say they were together. They were together. I'm sure of it. And the reason that's important is because of a couple of slides I'm going to show you that are going to come up. Okay. So we know Washington stopped at the Crooked Billet, and then he was somewhere 8 miles from Wilmington. Okay. So there's the Crooked Billet. He's there in the morning. He has breakfast. Of course, that's a decisive point, because the Army's making a critical turn there. And the other place the Army's making a critical turn is 8 miles from Wilmington in Fairview. So he's there. So you have to go with me on this ride. Washington and Lafayette are up where that second star is for a later part of the day. They're right here. And they're watching the Army go by, probably conferring with his commanders. Okay. Now, how we put this together? I told you about that visit that Lafayette made to the DuPonts in 1825. He stays overnight with Victor DuPont at Levere's, right across from the DuPont Country Club. In the morning, he gets up and he crosses the footbridge and goes over to the Hagley side, and they link up with EI. And they get into a carriage, actually a procession of carriages, because the DuPonts are going to turn Lafayette over to the veterans of Pennsylvania who are going to take him for a tour of the Battle of Brandywine later in the day. So this is in July of 1825. This is the journal of Lafayette's secretary. And Lafayette's secretary says that the DuPonts had him in a carriage, and they took him to the place along the river where they thought he crossed in 1777. But Lafayette stands up and he says, this cannot be the place where we crossed in 1777. It must be a little higher up. Okay, so where was he when he said this? He was at Smith's Bridge. How do I know that? I found a letter written by Sophie DuPont, EI's daughter, in the archives out at Hagley. She was with them on this trip. She got in the carriage with them, and she wrote, thank God she wrote a description. We'd have never known where this was, but she says they went up Monchannon Road, and that led right to Smith's Bridge, the only bridge across the Brandywine in 1825. And if you got a caravan or wagons, that's where you're going. That's where they thought he crossed. But he stood up and he said, no, it was a little further up. So, what's that tell us? It tells us he had to cross at either Corner Ford or Piles Ford. Okay? So how do we break it down then, between those two? Remember I told you the artillery was coming up. They came up the Kennet Pike, and they are causing stress on Stockford Road. They've got it plugged up while the goat rope goes on to get them across the river here. So if Washington is at this intersection, 8 miles, with Lafayette at Fairview, he cannot get down this way. Okay? Very simple. He just rides down to this little intersection, rides down Cosart Road, and goes up like this. And that perfectly matches Lafayette's description. That's why I think he crossed. That's why I think he crossed the Piles Ford. I don't think there's any doubt about it. So, well, of course there's doubt, but you know, go with me on this one. But I'm lacking any other. So I think we've got some pretty good evidence, thanks to the letters and Levasseur. I'm pretty sure that this is what happened. The other thing is that if you notice in that quote, Lafayette doesn't say this is where I crossed. He said this is where we crossed. You know, I'm just confident he was with Washington. And when you go to the Battle of the Brandywine, they're right next to each other the whole time during the battle. Everywhere they go, they're together. So they were together here. Okay, and this makes sense. If you go down there today, you go down Cosart Road, and honest to God, you are back in time. There is nothing on that road to indicate you're not in 1777 other than the asphalt. You were on an ancient road, and that was the access road to Piles Ford. And he had seen Piles Ford on his recon, so he knew where it was. Okay, last slide. The conclusions. I think the Army moved in 3 echelons. We know for a fact there was a guy, it was Reverend Reed. I think Knox moved the artillery as a whole up the Kennet Pike using the 2 fords. He needed both fords in the ferry. I think the Army moved on multiple routes using 4 fords, and that would have been consistent with the requirements that Washington had to meet. He had to get up there fast, he had to go with speed, he had to go with security, and he had to go with simplicity. And that, I think it meets all those requirements. Baggage moved up Concord Pike, no doubt about it. And I think that Washington and Lafayette themselves crossed at Piles Ford. They rode right up past Jansen's, right up past Buckley's, made the turn at Fairview. The road is clogged up with artillery. They're not going to get down that way, so they take a right and go down to Cosart Road to Piles Ford. Now, they didn't cross at Chad's Ford because Lafayette would have said that. I mean, he knew what Chad's Ford was. So it just leaves, I couldn't figure out any way to get them to Corner Ford. It just doesn't make any sense. There's no way he would have gotten there. So that's what leaves that. I'm going to show you one last slide. If you want to go out today and visit these places, this is where you can go. Center Road is kind of, modernity has caught up with us on Center Road. It's kind of a super highway and it's moved all over the place. You can still go out and see the Crooked Billet. You can drive back into that gated community and see the mansion. And part of it was the tavern. The Kennet Road exists. Piles Ford Road exists. You can drive down it and see it. Monchannon Road, the Army used that. Of course, Concord Pike, good luck with that one. What doesn't show on here is the Fairview Road. It's just up past Centerville. You go up about another mile and you come to that intersection. And you can miss it. You gotta look real close and turn right and just go down Fairview Road. And it's called the Fairview Road on the first part, and then you get to an intersection where it splits off Cosart and pick your battle, go down the road. And it's a beautiful ride on a Sunday, and you'll know you're you're on hollowed ground when you go up that way. Are there any questions?